Okay, everyone, it's a few minutes past 12, so we can get started. Welcome to this webinar on climate finance, COP29, and humanitarianism. My name is Iida-Maria Tammi. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Humanitarian Action, or CHA, here in Berlin, and I will be moderating today's discussion. The session is organized in CHA's out-of-the-box format, which is an agile brown bag lunch event series that we offer every now and again on contemporary humanitarian issues. Before we move onwards with today's session, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of housekeeping rules. I'd like to let you know that the event is being recorded. We're also quite a big group, and I'm sure more and more people will be joining as the session progresses. So I would like to ask all of you to keep your cameras off, keep your microphones turned off. This said, participants are warmly welcome to make comments and ask questions to the speakers. You can use the chat function to do this. You can either write in the public Zoom chat, or then you can send a private message to me. I'll do my best to keep pace with the questions that are coming in. So next, I'd like to introduce our two great speakers today. First, we have Sabine Minninger, who is a policy advisor on climate change at the German Development Organization, Bread for the World. She has been following the UNFCCC process since 2008, working together with partners from the Global South to call for climate justice to the poorest and most vulnerable people on this planet. Sabine's areas of expertise are many and include, among others, climate mitigation and adaptation, loss and damage, climate-related migration and displacement, as well as climate finance, which is the topic of our session today. And Sabine has just returned from Baku, Azerbaijan, where she participated in the 29th Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, or COP29. Welcome, Sabine. Our second speaker is Dr. Gabriela Alberola. Gabriela, or Gabby, works as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Amsterdam, where she focuses on subnational distribution of climate change funding in the Global South specifically. She's looking particularly at the effectiveness, equity, and transparency of climate finance. In addition to this, Gabriela is also a co-author of a recent UN Women study on gender-responsive climate finance. In terms of education, Gabriela holds a PhD in environmental science and management, as well as a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a Master of Science in Watershed Science and Policy from California State University. It goes without saying that this is obviously a very interesting background, and Gabriela has a lot of expertise in topics that are maybe not so common or familiar for humanitarian experts or professionals yet, but at the same time have increasing importance and relevance in the sector. So it should make for a very interesting conversation and contribution. Welcome, Gabriela.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ida.
And as said before, my own name is Iida-Maria Tammi from Center for Humanitarian Action, and I will be moderating today's conversation. As background a little bit, in my moderation, I'll be drawing on some of the findings of my recent CHA research paper called More Than Money, Why Climate Finance Matters for Humanitarian Organizations. I won't go into the findings too much at this point, but the paper itself is an attempt to understand climate finance from a humanitarian perspective. It examines the different points of overlap and contestation between humanitarian action and climate finance. In addition to which it tries to identify very concrete ways in which humanitarian actors can contribute towards a more efficient and fair use of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage funding. In terms of these measures, among others, the paper encourages humanitarian organizations to actively try to contest or resist risk-averse donor policies, which are one of the main inhibitors preventing climate finance from reaching fragile and conflict-affected settings, as well as to draw on their operational experience to really concretize to donors as well as to the broader public what it means if the adaptation funding gap is not closed. The paper also highlights the importance of aligning the policy demands of humanitarian organizations with those of climate vulnerable developing countries for the purpose of maximizing synergies and ensuring best possible support for the climate justice demands of these communities. But as said, I won't go further into this at this point. We're slightly pressed for time, and I'm sure you're very interested to hear what Gabriela and Sabine have to say. So rather, let's dive straight into the discussion. I prepared a couple of questions myself for the two speakers, but you're most welcome to contribute any questions at any point in the chat, and I will then relay these questions to the speakers. But maybe we start with you, Sabine, if that's okay. As said, you just returned from Baku, where you participated in COP29. One of the expectations for the conference was to make key decisions on climate finance, including setting a new quantified goal to replace the previous 100 billion US dollars in mitigation and adaptation finance annually. Now, developing countries entered the negotiations demanding trillions instead of billions in funding. And in the end, what we got was a sum of $300 billion in public climate finance. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the process of negotiating this new climate finance goal, including the positions of humanitarian actors that were present in Baku.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. Thank you so much for having me here. And it feels actually like a post-COP therapy to get rid of my chest, all the frustration that I collected there, and glad that there are people interested in the outcome, because we have to move forward. We cannot turn our back on the process. We have to use this multilateral process to move forward. So one thing, Nida, it was everywhere announced that industrialized countries committed to a new target of 300 billion. That is not true. They did not commit to 300 trillion in public finance. They only wrote, they stated, industrialized countries take a lead on 300 billion, and it's not clear what they meant with that. So industrialized countries, they pushed for broadening the donor base, and they needed to have language that is open also for new contributors such as China, for example, or Saudi Arabia to come in. So they made clear that they are not responsible for that. But industrialized countries also said they are not leaving the table. That's their red line. They need language that is opening a bit for getting more donors on board. So therefore, the language is clear. It's not industrialized countries providing 300 billion in public finance. It is only taking a lead. And the public finance is not clear at all. It's from various sources, everything. You can basically count everything into that. Also, concessional loans, but also private finance flows that no one can, we have no transparency about it. And the same also with regular market-based loans with high interest rates. They're also voice is not clear at all. Okay, is it me? Then I have. You hear me?
I can hear you very well. I think Gabriela as well.
Okay, good. If it's only one person, then we hear you well. All right. So this is already one problem. We have not an increase of provision. to be very clear about it. So industrialized countries made clear, if you want to have more money, then you developing countries have to make sure that high-income developing countries and those who are also emitting on a high level, like China or Saudi Arabia, that they also have to commit. This is where you get the increase from. And therefore, as there was no clear commitment, the language went in that direction that they take the lead. But if you look into what they have committed to, you see that they did not commit at all to an increase. They did not. And then if you calculate inflation into the value of money in 10 years, it's also unclear. So in fact, they only restated their old commitment of 100 billion. So it's on us now in civil society to make sure that the 300 billion have to be grant-based, and we have to work towards our governments to make sure that we get new finance sources, innovative finance sources based on the polluter pays principle to add to that. And then the aspirational goal to reach 1.3 trillion US dollar is still in the text, but it's an aspirational goal and it calls upon all actors. It's written all actors. So you can calculate whatever you want to into this. It's more a vision. What is good is that they also decided on a pathway, let's say a workshop over the year, to decide how, or let's not decide, more like working on how can we reach this aspirational goal. And I hope that in these workshops there will come a clear signal to governments: you have to phase out fossil fuels, you have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels, and you have to use that money for climate finance. And you also have to work on new innovative finance sources, such as the billionaire's tax, a levy on private jets, first class tickets, business class tickets, and of course, the taxation of the fossil fuel industry themselves. What went very wrong was that loss and damage was kicked out of the text at the end. It means that the new quantified, the new collective quantified goal, the new climate finance target after 2025 is not including loss and damage. And that means that what is important for humanitarian aid, that there is no additional finance for loss and damage. And the loss and damage finance is there to upscale humanitarian aid according to the polluter pays principle. Humanitarian aid and the finance provision works on the principle of solidarity. Climate finance works on the principle of polluter pays. And as we see that humanitarian aid budgets will be eaten up by the climate crisis, and humanitarian aid doesn't have the financial backing also to deal on top with the climate crisis, which will be very, very expensive, we all called civil society, humanitarian aid organizations like the countries most impacted, they called for including loss and damage into the new climate finance target, that industrialized countries and welcome also other donors go into a self-commitment for new provision, additional finance, additional to humanitarian aid, additional to adaptation finance, and additional to development assistance, the ODA, by new sources. That this money should help and upscale the work of humanitarian aid organizations, especially in the field now related to loss and damage. The scope of the new the scope of the new loss and damage fund, which is there, is also to address displacement. And this is clearly the role of humanitarian organizations who are working on the ground, and they should benefit from grants coming out of the loss and damage fund projects that are financed. We see that the fund is now established. The loss and damage fund is there. We saw also that we have around now 800 million US dollar in it. What we need is 8 billion US dollar. So what we need is basically 800 billion, sorry, 800 billion US dollar. So we need far more. There's a huge risk gap that needs to be closed. And the risk gap is growing by inaction. And we see that the voluntary pledges to the loss and damage fund are so low. They are so low that this is by far not enough to address the problem. And I mean, seriously, it's just enough to set up an office in the World Bank and start working. So this is probably enough to start functioning, but not really to cure the problem and upscale humanitarian aid. That was a failed opportunity. And what we see now, there is no self-commitment of the polluters also to take responsibility for loss and damage and the humanitarian havoc it will cause. And that is something we need to correct now. There are opportunities. The next board meeting will take place of the next board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund will take place now next week in Manila in the Philippines. That is an opportunity to influence the board also to come up with a pledging strategy. We need a pledging conference, and to be honest, the pledging is not enough. It's not enough that this is a matter of not of solidarity to pay into the fund. It's a matter of responsibility. Those who have created the problem have to pay for it. And therefore, I wait more, not for a pledging conference, but for a strategy how to fill the fund. And there should be a taxation or levy dedicated to the fund according to the polluter pays principle that goes straight to the fund. So why not having a levy as a start, for example? Why not having a levy on private jets? They are polluting the atmosphere and they're not taking their part of the responsibility. The same with first-class tickets and also a share of fossil fuel industry taxation. I leave it by that, yeah? And then I am happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, thanks. Great. Not so great news from COP, but we'll have a chance to discuss this further in a moment. Next, I'd like to turn to you, Gabriela. So from Sabine, I was asking about the quantities of climate finance, and while this is certainly very important for our efforts to tackle climate change, for them to be effective and just, the funding needs to go where the needs are greatest. And Gabriela, your work deals specifically with the allocation of climate finance in the Global South. Could you tell us what it is that we currently know about the distribution of funding between different groups and countries? And is it really so that climate finance reaches communities that need it the most or not?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the first thing that I would like to clarify is that our knowledge, collective knowledge for academics, for practitioners, for anyone interested in where funds go, is very much constrained by the lack of data. There is so much opacity in how climate funding is distributed, how it is tracked, the accounting in it. We get reports from different nonprofit organizations every year telling us, hey, this bank is double counting or is counting inadequately, and what they're reporting is very different from what we actually see on the ground when we do our own investigation. So that is, I would say, the first issue is that there is a lack of standards and a lack of data in how climate finance is recorded and how it is communicated to the rest of the world. So that introduces the first issue. But with the data that we have, either say from the OECD has a statistics database of where climate finance goes at the level of countries. From those data, we can infer we can get some information, even though the data is not yet ideal. And then some of us also do our own research. In my case, I looked at different funds in 7 countries in Central America and the Caribbean, going through their public-facing documents, trying to figure out where funds were going subnationally at the level of municipalities. So first, with the bigger data, say from the OECD, we know that funds tend to go at a lower proportion on average to countries that experience fragility or that are affected by conflict. That is a huge issue because you can imagine these are the countries that are at the highest need for funds because they experience that combined effect of climate change risk and fragility and conflict. When we talk about climate change vulnerability, and this is something that I would like to clarify before we go deeper into the answer, climate change vulnerability is a very specific type of vulnerability. It is composed of 3 components: sensitivity to climate change, adaptive capacity, that is your ability or the ability of a system to respond to climate change, and exposure to climate change, whether current exposure or projected exposure based on robust models of how much rain is going to change, how much temperature is going to change, etc. So it's the combination of these 3 factors. And the fact that we find that conflict affected and fragile contexts received lower climate finance on average as compared to their more stable counterparts is already quite troubling. The issue that I find in my own research looking at the subnational distribution of climate finance is that I find that funds are not going to the places that have these 3 components. We do see funds going to poorer areas, which is not bad. It's a good thing. We would be in way worse territory if we found funds going to richer areas, but we still don't see this comprehensive understanding and allocation of climate finance based on this comprehensive vulnerability. And that puts us at risk because it is leaving the most vulnerable communities behind, those at the intersection of sensitivity, low adaptive capacity, and high exposure to climate change. I think the last thing that I would like to add to that is that in terms of knowing this evaluation of whether funds are going to the most vulnerable places, we still have a long way to go. There's still so much more to do in terms of assessment of vulnerability in this comprehensive way, and then in terms of recording data of where funds are going and being more transparent, having better standards. All of those things can help us ensure that funds are going to the more vulnerable place. Right now, data suggests that not quite, and also that we can't know for sure because of this lack of information.
Super, thank you very much. Currently we have one question from the audience, if I'm not mistaken, in the chat. I'll pose one question to each of our speakers, still from my side, and I give the audience a moment to think up other things that they would like to ask from you. Sabine, before you mentioned the question of, or the issue of broadening climate finance donor base, and from the perspective of humanitarian organizations, this kind of reshuffles our notions of who are donors of aid and who are recipients of the aid. So I was wondering if you could examine this question a bit from a humanitarian perspective and explain to us what this potential redrafting of the climate finance donor base could mean for humanitarian organizations.
Not much at the moment, because as far as I see it, the donor base has not broadened in terms of grants. And this is what humanitarian aid means. I mean, seriously, humanitarian aid is not based on loans. And the donor base was not really broadened. I mean, it is like the multilateral development banks play now a bigger role. Excuse me, and that is about loans and not grants. Therefore, that has no implication. There is a big South-South cooperation already going on, but it is in form von loans and not from grants.
Okay, thank you. And Gabriela, I've asked about your postdoc work now, but you also co-authored a UN Women study on gender-responsive climate finance, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit next. I've understood that originally in this study, you set out to analyze the extent to which climate finance reflects the needs of people of different genders, particularly in conflict-affected and fragile settings. Yet, as your research progressed, you came to realize that there are significant discrepancies in what gender responsive actually is taken to mean by different stakeholders. Could you tell us a bit more about this process of defining and measuring gender responsive or gender responsiveness in climate finance, as well as give us your own view as to why gender responsive climate finance is so important?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I would like to start actually with your second question on why gender responsive climate finance or climate action is important. I think that one of the things that seemed the most interesting to me whenever I told people I was working on this report was the reply, well, climate change is impacting everyone equally, right? Like, why do we care about the impact? Like, what do you mean that is different for women and girls or for different gender identities? And I think that it made me realize that something that is perhaps obvious to some of us working in the space is not necessarily obvious to everyone. So I want to start with that on why we talk about gender differentiated impacts from climate change. And this is not based on biology, by the way, or at least not exclusively based on biology. This is based on the social structures that create unfavorable conditions for women to, for example, access climate finance, right? If you're in a context where women have lower access or no access to land titling, they're going to have a harder time accessing climate finance. If we talk about a context where there's reduced access to education, reduced access to health along gender lines, we are going to see that translated into lower access to information and resources, funding, et cetera, for climate change impacts, for mitigation and adaptation. We also see that in how climate can affect women and girls differently. And a very simplified example, but that I think can drive the point home, is that if we think of communities where women and girls are the ones that are, say, collecting wood for cooking, if they now have to walk a longer distance because there is a drought, because there is deforestation or some other environmental / climate impact, their burden, their work burden is higher, and also their exposure to violence is also going to increase. So we do see increase in gender-based violence, increase in women's and girls' workloads related to climate change, already seeing evidence of this. Higher exposure to violence, again, and also just because of women's traditional roles as caretakers, for example, we do see women experiencing worse impacts during disasters because their mobility is more restricted if they are the caretakers of children and the elderly. So because of all of these dimensions of how gender interacts with the impacts of climate change, we talk about gender sensitive or gender responsive climate finance. Climate finance mechanisms need to be aware of where these gender differentiated impacts are, where the difficulties and entry points for women are for accessing climate finance, and addressing those concerns, also understanding women's and girls' needs and other gender identities needs, right? It's not the same. In the study, for example, we interviewed people in 3 countries, in Guatemala, Haiti, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And some of the comments that I received from interviewees in Guatemala, for example, were that a lot of the climate finance was geared towards cattle ranching. Cattle rancher cattle ranching traditionally being a male-dominated field, we already see how things are biased towards men, not so much for women, again, with issues of access to land titling and other, difficulties in accessing credit, basically made it more difficult for women to know and access climate finance. So what do we find in our research? Again, very much constrained by inadequate tracking. It is very difficult to know whether climate finance is addressing the needs or differentiated needs of women and girls. We did an analysis, a large data analysis with data again from the OECD, looking at a marker that has three settings or three tiers. They do a tagging where they tell us if a specific project either does not have any gender considerations, has some gender considerations, or gender is the principal component of it. And of course, unsurprisingly, gender is not a key component in most of climate finance, which is already problematic. But again, the data itself is very tricky. When we dig deeper and we take a look at what those projects that are reported as having a high gender responsiveness, we find that it's not quite. For example, we could see, say, a project on mass transit, and it leaves us wondering, well, is that necessarily a strong gender responsive climate adaptation or climate mitigation project? Maybe not. So the tracking needs to be a lot better. The tagging needs to be a lot better. Again, transparency and better tracking is essential to be able to assess if climate finance is gender responsive or not. And what we find is that it's very hard to define and understand if it is right now or not.
Thanks, Gabriela. I have two questions from the audience at this point, which I'd like to address to you. I think they both are directed to both of you. So feel free to pick on either one or both of them. I'll just read them out to you. So the first question is from Kai, who notes that Afghanistan ranks among the top 10 most vulnerable countries to environmental disasters globally, with a majority of its population affected. Despite this, there's a recent study funded by UN Women that shows that communities do not feel prepared for disasters and receive little to no information on how to prepare for disasters, highlighting an urgent need for early warning systems and clear guidelines on safety procedures during disasters. However, due to the political situation, presumably in the country, and the lack of engagement with the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, there's little progress on this from the community perspective. So how would either one of the speakers, Gabriela or Sabine, think that this can be made more of a priority for humanitarian actors? I'll also share the second question with you. You can then view both of these in the chat if you want to double check. The second question is from Eski from the IRC, who says that she'd be interested on your take regarding how we as civil society can best approach governments, in this case particularly the German government, to encourage them to do more after the disappointing COP29 outcomes, and what arguments could be most likely to cut through this in particular, keeping in mind that so many organizations did so much great advocacy in the lead up already, but were unfortunately largely ignored. Sabine, want to take Eski's question?
Very happy to do that. And I can also answer the other one, but I feel that Gabriela is also, that she should do the other one. Because as civil society, we do a very outspoken lobby and advocacy towards the German government. And I would love to encourage the humanitarian field to become a bit more noisy now. Because the argument is still in the climate theater. That's what the US is saying, but also I still hear it from German policymakers, that we have the humanitarian aid, and this is what loss and damage is about. So we need now the humanitarian aid stepping up in their lobby and advocacy and become as vocal as the climate community is, and say clearly, no, we are unable to take on top the climate crisis. That has to become not based on a solidarity principle, but according to the polluter pays principle. And we should join hands here. We have to do this hand in hand. The climate bubble, who is very vocal on climate justice topics, and now we need more the humanitarian bubble to support this call for climate justice coming from your bubble. The links are made. I think in the last 2 years we cooperated far more better, but still we could get out of our silos and become vocal together. I feel that the humanitarian aid is very shy and humble. That's not what they do. They are not screaming for climate justice. It's based on the solidarity principle. They're calling more for help and aid. But climate justice is not about help. It's to take the responsibility for the damage that you have caused. You are responsible to pay for that. And this is something that is not really triggered down in the nature and DNA of humanitarian aid, lobby, and advocacy. And here, I wish that we could cooperate more closely. We need more exchange. We need to work together on lobby and advocacy strategies, because I have the feeling at the moment, loss and damage is not tackled. They say, well, we do some peanuts here in adaptation finance. We do a double counting with development assistance. And if something happened out there in the world, well, then we come together and pledge some funds for humanitarian aid. They can do it. And this is not the way forward. We have to push together that the finance, which is there, the money is there. We invest a lot of money in fueling the climate crisis, but not in tackling and taking over the responsibility. So we need now to come up and say clearly, we have to upscale humanitarian aid according to the polluter pays principle through the loss and damage debate by deciding on new innovative finance sources and taking the fossil fuel subsidies out there and allocate it to loss and damage finance. This is the way to do it. So, and here we have to become more vocal now with the new government coming. And I think we also have to explain together, and that is where we need the humanitarian people, because you have firsthand experience in that. We have to explain together that every cent that we are investing in mitigation, adaptation, and in loss and damage helps to stabilize world peace. And if we don't do that, we will have more humanitarian disasters, more conflicts, armed conflicts as well, about scarce sources and the fight for livelihood. And any military action that might then happen is far more expensive than dealing now and helping the people to get back on their feet and helping them to find a future and dignity in a climate crisis. And that is something that we have to do together. By the way, IRC, I see that you are here. You asked the question, right? International Red Cross. I'm quoting.
IRC, International Rescue Committee.
Ah, okay. I thought it's IRC, International Red Cross. Okay, good. Yeah, it's your bubble. You're better in this. Yeah, okay. However, I'm quoting. I'm not only quoting if I talk about data. I'm not only quoting the IPCC report, of the so-called climate report of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm quoting a lot the data from humanitarian actors, such, for example, the International Red Cross, and making to explain that that not every weather extreme event has a postcard saying this cyclone that was me, climate change, and now sent the bill to Australia. That won't happen. But we have very clear now, the science is crystal clear that we have an increase of weather extreme events due to climate change. We also have the data from the humanitarian field, who show clearly we have an increase of 30% or 3 times more weather extreme events that you're dealing with than in the past. And all of that is very helpful for our lobby and advocacy activities, because there's still people out there that say, it's weather. We always had weather. We always had a dry summer. We had a wet summer, whatever. And that is not true. So we have to come up and show clearly that the humanitarian aid is not prepared to deal with the climate crisis, and that is far bigger than, we cannot allow people like the Alternative for Germany, right-wing populist. I mean, one of the famous right-wing populists becomes now the most powerful office in the world, Donald Trump. And we cannot allow that playing down the climate crisis, ignoring the facts, is taking over. And all sources, also from the humanitarian field, are very important data to convince policymakers that it's far cheaper to deal with humanitarian disasters, to deal with it, to prevent them, or to do forecast financing, to prevent and minimize the risk, than dealing with another war, another crisis, while we have already so many multiple crises, which are far more expensive than doing effective climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Gabriela, would you like to reflect on either one of the questions, maybe on the Afghanistan one?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, I just want to start by saying, Sabine, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you. I echo and second everything that you just said. Feel free to add to this answer as well on the Afghanistan question. More broadly, this question is about this. This is very typical that the countries that are at the highest need, with the highest intersectional vulnerability, tend to have lower levels of readiness, tend to have more stability. So that is often an issue that contributors or donors cite as, we cannot do higher programming or invest more in this country because there's a lot of corruption, because there's instability, because we don't have diplomatic ties. So this is something that is replicated constantly. That is a very common problem, and something that people dedicate a lot of time trying to figure out, how do we overcome those barriers, right? Like, how do we get climate finance to the places that need it the most, knowing that there are some barriers to getting the funding where it needs to be, and to being effective and efficient with that funding. In my research and interviews that I've done in fragile and conflict-affected settings, some of the things that I've heard are better or more flexible, I should say, more flexible funding. When the funding is very strict and it's governed by an office somewhere in Geneva, far away from where things are happening, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and lots of complication, it is very hard to pivot, right? If you had funding for a project in one location, and all of a sudden that location is no longer accessible, pivoting and moving that money somewhere else can be very complicated when the structure, the bureaucratic structure within these big multilateral organizations, for example, is very complicated. So more flexible funding is one of the potential solutions for this. Another one is incorporating conflict-sensitive programming. And part of conflict-sensitive programming can be that increased flexibility, but it's a lot more of identifying where things can go wrong, and then having some mechanisms in place to deal with that. So when there is conflict, funding and the project or the program doesn't completely abandon the country immediately, but that there are some kind of like plan B and C and D to continue the programming in some way. The third one, and this is something that I learned from a colleague, a Haitian colleague that works in disaster aid in Haiti. She was telling me how when there is a crisis international personnel will likely leave the country immediately, but the communities that are there, the people that are there working on the ground, the locals that are involved in these processes, they stay. They are still exposed to the crisis and to the violence, but they have to continue on with their lives. They do have the local networks to continue to do some work at a different capacity, perhaps at a diminished capacity, but they're still there. So taking advantage of those local networks that exist, of those connections and the work that people on the ground are doing, is one mechanism that in her experience was not sufficiently utilized. A lot of the money the programming stays at layers of international aid workers, but stronger and reliance, incorporation of local knowledge, local work, local networks can make a big difference. And then finally, lobbying for more money mobilized as grants instead of loans. So when we talk about climate finance, we talk about a lot of different financing mechanisms. Broadly speaking, we can put them in two buckets: free money as grants, and then loans. Loans increase the debt burden for countries. So it's it is indeed adding insult to injury, because loans make the contributing countries richer at the expense of the countries that they have already caused so much damage with climate change. So lobbying and pushing for more grants and for grant equivalent finance that doesn't make countries go further into debt to address their climate concerns is, I would say, another key issue that could help in this regard. But it is a complicated issue for sure. We see this across the board, that the countries and the areas that need the funds the most, it can be very hard to get the funds there, but there are mechanisms and things that we can do to improve that landscape for sure.
Thanks very much. A lot of important messages, both to donors as well as humanitarian organizations, how work is actually carried out. This question of loans is also something that I touch upon in my own paper as an obvious challenge for the affected countries, but also in the terms of humanitarian aid, making a lot of the funding inaccessible to aid organizations. Like Sabine mentioned, humanitarian organizations very rarely can benefit from loan money. They do not produce a profit through their operations. And then also from the perspective of the affected countries, takes a chunk away from their budgets, directing it towards catering or managing these loans. And this is all money that's then taken away from development or responding to potential humanitarian crisis. So it really is a vicious cycle. I see we're already 10 to 1. I know, Sabine, you need to run in a few minutes. I'd like to end the conversation by posing a question to both of you speakers. First, I would like to request that you identify one key issue or debate that humanitarians should follow in the climate finance space. I'm assuming that a lot of our audience come from humanitarian organizations. So what is one issue that they should keep an eye on, as well as to suggest one concrete measure or way in which humanitarian actors could support more equitable distribution of climate funds. Gabriela, could we start with you?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
I have to go and
yes.
I have to be out here in 3 minutes and I have no chance to stay any longer. And I really don't want to cut down Gabriela.
Do you want to go first, Sabine? Go ahead.
Please, sorry, I have no other chance. I'm sorry.
Go.
So what you have to follow is loss and damage. You have to make sure that the fund is filled and you have to make sure that you have a seat in the board. You need to be represented in the board meetings of the loss and damage fund. There is a representation, but it has to be strongly anchored and you have to make sure that you are involved. The humanitarian aid has to be involved in all decision makings of the loss and damage board. And this is an ongoing thing now. You have to represent it also in the technical decision making, because the technical decision making will be done in the Santiago network for loss and damage. And the funding instrument will be the loss and damage fund. And the roof, the political roof, will be built by the, it is the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage. And the more you can influence the political roof, the technical assistant, and the finance decision, the more you have an influence where the money is going to and how efficient it is distributed. And please, let's stay in touch on this topic. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sabine. Thanks so much for coming. Gabriela, over to you. Are you here, Gabi? Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Yes, so sorry, having some technical issues here. Luckily, it's happening at the last 5 minutes. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
very well.
wonderful. Thank you. So I would say, I mean, there are so many areas for improvement with climate finance. I would say one that is personally very close to my heart. So I am from Panama. Panama has one of the first communities that is having to migrate because of sea level rise, the community of Gardi-Subdub. It's an indigenous territory. It's an island in the indigenous territory of Gunayala. And they are having to migrate not in 5 years, not in 20 years, but right now in 2024, they're having to relocate the entire island because of sea level rise concerns. So for me, this issue of equity and the issue of ensuring that funds are reaching the vulnerable communities that need it the most, I think is a key debate and an area where everyone working in the space can have an impact by having an increased awareness of how opaque the landscape is with tracking. It was very shocking for me when I started working in the space, knowing how little tracking is done, particularly at the subnational level. We literally do not know where funds end up at the level of provinces, at the level of municipalities within countries. And vulnerability to climate change is not distributed equally within countries. So this tracking is essential, more transparency, better standards. I would add better gender tracking to know if funds are being gender responsive and addressing the differentiated needs of women and girls. But back to the alignment with vulnerability, I tend to call this low-hanging fruit because both donors and recipients have to do a lot of reporting for grants and loans for climate finance. They record a lot of information about these projects, and recording in some standardized way, you know, using administrative units within countries of where funds are going is not a big ask. But it can make such a huge difference in insurance, in ensuring effectiveness, in ensuring equity in the allocation of climate finance. So I would say that advocating for more transparency and a standardization of reporting is a huge area where if you have the opportunity to influence, please do, because it can make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree with this question of transparency and tracking. On the one hand, it also makes it very difficult to advocate for different types of funding or where the funding goes and so on if you don't actually know what is the lay of the land at the moment. Yeah, and another issue is that it also makes it tricky identifying possible overlaps or double counting of climate finance with different types of other existing funding, such as ODA, including both humanitarian and development aid. It's a very important point. 3 minutes to 1, we'll stop here. Many thanks for coming, both Gabriela and Sabine, as well as the audience. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you're interested in participating in any other CHA events in the future, you can always visit our website or subscribe to our newsletter. I think there's information in the chat. And if you happen to be based in Berlin, you're very warmly welcome to attend our next in-person event, which is on the tsunami 2004 and the lessons learned. The event will be held next week, Tuesday, 3rd December. So look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again, and I wish you all a very nice rest of the day.